So what are variables? And how many types of variables do we have in JavaScript? Variables are the absolute foundation of programming. If you understand variables, you understand how a program thinks. Now, in order to help you understand what a variable is, I have this example. Imagine you are moving into a house and you have the boxes of items. In order to understand what is inside each of the box, you label them. So we will have a labeled box and a value inside that box is going to be your item. Now this box represents the variable. So how we define a variable is using the syntax, where the first word is the keyword that is provided by JavaScript. And we have three different types of keyword in order to define our variables. So what we would do is we would say let, which is a keyword, then the name of our variable, username, and then we would assign the value to that variable. You can see we can also reassign a value to that same variable. So why do we need the variables in programming? There are three big reasons. The first one is to remember the information, the second is to reuse the values, and the third is to make the code readable. Let's actually do this in our browser. So I have opened up the console inside the Chrome. Let's talk about the first reason, to remember information. Let's say you're watching a football match and you have to keep track of the Germany's team goals. Now, in order to remember that information, what we can do is we can say let score equals 0. So this is the initial score. And every time a score changes, we are going to increase the score by 1. This is the first reason why we use variables. Now the second one is to reuse the values. Let's say we are working with something of an accountant stuff and we need to find the tax on a given amount. So one way to do it is we would write the amount. Actually, let's store it in a variable called x and the amount and multiply it by the tax rate. Let's say we have the tax as 15%. So it is going to be 0.15. Now I can print the value of x. And you can see it says 1500, which is correct. But let's say we now have to calculate the tax on another amount. So we would create another variable called y. And our amount this time is going to be 20,000. And we will have the same tax rate. I can print y and you can see the result. So this is working, right? Can you spot any problem here? So we have the tax rate as 15% in both cases. So we are writing the same logic again and again, and if there are like 10 amounts, we are doing the same thing. So instead of repeating ourselves, what we can do is we can say let tax is equal to 0.15 and let amount equals 30,000 this time. And in order to get the result, we would just simply multiply the amount with the tax and we can get our result. And now the next time whatever the amount comes in, we will just update the amount and the tax will always stay the same. So let's say we have amount is equal to 40,000. We do not need to change the tax. The tax is always going to be 15%. So I can do is amount into tax. And here I get the result. Now here you can see that we can reuse the values inside the variables in order to remove the redundancy of writing the same thing over and over again. And also at the same time, you can see it makes our code more readable. If I was just doing 10,000 into 0.15, I would have to explain it manually what it is doing. But if I have the amount variable and the tax variable, and every time I'm multiplying the amount with the tax, everybody can read this, right? So these are the three big reasons why we have variables. So variables makes our code readable like a sentence. Now that all brings us to our next question, and that is how many types of variables do we have in JavaScript? So I'm going to clear my console and reload the page. Okay, so now I'm going to explain you the different types of variables that we have in JavaScript. So basically there are two different types of variables. As the name suggests, a variable is something that values can change, but we can also have a variable whose value never changes. The syntax that you have seen me write is let a is equal to 10. and I can print the value of a. Now if I try to change the value of a to 20, that also works. So what let allows us to do is to create variables whose value can be changed after the initial value. And the counterpart to that is the constant. A constant is a variable whose value never changes. So if I type pi, you can see I have set the value to 3.14, and when I print it, it says 3.14. But if I try to reassign a value, let's say 3.25, it throws an error. So this is the second type of variable we can have. And assignment to constant variable is not allowed in JavaScript. So basically constants are the values that always stays the same. And as a rule of thumb, try to use constant as much as possible unless you really need to define a variable whose value can be changed. Now there is another way to define a variable whose value can be changed. We first saw let, there is another one called var. So var is similar to let, and we can say var x is equal to 1, 2, 3. And if I print x, you can see 1, 2, 3. And if I change the value of x to something like 2, 4, 5, it says 2, 4, 5. Now what is the difference between var and let then? So let is the modern way to define the variables whose values can be changed. And it should be your default choice. But before let, we had var. And it is an old way of declaring or defining a variable. I would recommend you to avoid it as a beginner, but there is a difference between var and let, and we will talk about those as well. But for now, just remember, we should always use let. Now, in order to understand what is the differences between all these three, I have this comparison table for you. So in var, we can reassign the value. Same case for let, but in a constant variable, we cannot reassign a value. What var allows us to do is to redeclare the same variable. And this is one of the issues that we faced, and that is why let was introduced. And let doesn't allow us to redeclare the same variable, and same goes for the constants. Reassignment and redeclaring are two different things. When we declare a variable, for example, if I go back and say let ABC, this is declaring. If I say let def is equal to some value, so this is assignment because I am assigning a value to variable named def. So with var and let, we can declare them and not initialize them. Initializing is assigning the value when we declare them. But in constant, since we cannot reassign the values, it is a must-have. So we must assign a value to a constant variable. Now I talked about the difference between var and let, and that is basically in these two different things, scopes and hoisting. These are out of the context for now, but we will come back to these exact things and we will discuss what is the difference between a var and let later on. Now there are some rules for naming the variable, and JavaScript has a small, strict set of rules for what counts as a valid variable name. So the first one is that it must start with a letter or an underscore or a $sign. It can never start with a number. So for example, if I say let 123a, if I can type correctly, let 123a is equal to a value. You can see we are getting an error. But if I do let a123 is equal to value, this works. And I also can make a variable with an underscore, and that will also work. So this is the first condition. A variable name must not start with a number. But after the first character, you can use letters, numbers, underscore, and $sign in any combination you want. So we have the flexibility after the first character. Now the third rule is that the case matters. Username with a capital N and the username with a small n are treated as two completely different variables. They are not the same thing. So make sure you pay attention to this. Now the next rule is that there should be no spaces, no hyphens, or any special character like @ hash or percentage in the variable name. And the last one is you cannot use a reserved word. For example, something like let, const, or function, if, class. These are the keywords that JavaScript provides, and we cannot use them as the variable name. So these are the rules that we must follow in order to name our variables. And beyond the actual rules, developers follow some unwritten conventions that are not necessary, but you will often see as a standard. So these are the conventions that normally follows. So the first one is the camel case. So a camel case is basically starts with a small alphabet. The first character is going to be small. And then for each of the word, we just capitalize the first character of that word. So in two words, first name, we are going to write in camel case as first. And then name is going to have the N capital. Similarly, we have Pascal case and the upper snake case that are very much common in JavaScript world. So this is all about variables. Next, let's talk about different data types that we have for variables.